Yeah, kia ora koutou. My name is Imogen Bassett. I'm the Principal Advisor of Biosecurity at Auckland Council. So I was asked to come and talk about feral cats today, and so just to preface that, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. Feral cats is a topic that really can be quite polarising and you know, brings out some stuff about people's values. So when I'm talking about cats, I like to just tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a cat lover. I've had a lot of cats in my life. I grew up with many cats, and it was me at a younger and cuter age with one of our cats. But I'm also a conservationist, so I do what I do for a living because you know, my real passion is about protecting our Indigenous biodiversity. I don't currently have a cat, and I don't ever see myself living with a cat again because of that. But one of the most awesome experiences of my life was going to the Galapagos and just seeing, you know, that amazing richness of biodiversity, and so that's the stuff that gets me out of bed. But it doesn't change the fact that I've loved a lot of cats in my life, and I see the real value in them as well. So what I'm going to cover today, just talk a little bit about the impacts of cats, what's the difference between a companion, stray or feral cat, how Auckland Council, what our role is in cat control, and also some advice for community cat control, because I understand you know, many people in the community are often vexed by the issue of cat impacts and wanting to do some control. So just a little bit about what our advice is to community groups in terms of how you can be doing that. And then my brief was feral cats, but actually I can't talk about cats without talking about responsible pet ownership, because actually that's the fence at the top of the cliff. So I'll touch on that a little bit as well. So as many of you will be aware, cats are a generalist predator. They eat a really wide range of different animals in our environment. And so that means many of our Indigenous animals are vulnerable to cat predation. And that's from your charismatic things like birds through to your bats, your insects, invertebrates, and reptiles as well. So cats can do a huge amount of damage in our environment, and we know that there are quite a number of species of our Indigenous birds that have been driven to extinction, either primarily or partly because of cat predation. So cats are a behavioural continuum. So they range from you know, a really tightly owned cat that might stay in bed, stay inside all night with you, maybe not be allowed to roam at all, right down to the other end of that sort of continuum of a completely feral cat that never has any interaction with humans at all. So it's a continuum, both in terms of the cat's behaviour and also in terms of the behaviour of the owners as well, when we're talking about those more owned animals. So, you know, what I might consider to be cat ownership might not be different from somebody else. You know, somebody might consider that they have a role as an owner or companion to a cat if they're leaving a bowl of milk at the end of the driveway, and somebody else may feel that, you know, they're not doing their job properly unless they're keeping their cat thoroughly contained. So these things are a continuum, but nonetheless, you know, people like to put things into boxes. It's quite simple, and so you will hear these three distinct classes of cats being talked about nationally. So the first one is these companion cats. So as it suggests, they're a pet, they're somebody's companion, and they're dependent on humans for their welfare. And then you'll often hear these two classes of unowned cats talked about. So you've got your strays, which probably still live around centres of human habitation. You know, they may once have been somebody's pet cat that has literally strayed, or they may be the offspring from that's living, you know, in the vicinity of humans. And they may be scavenging on a rubbish dump, or somebody may be leaving some food out for them, or that sort of thing. And then you have your feral cats, which are, according to these definitions, a paraphrase of the Companion Cats Code of Welfare, which is a national document that's sort of been widely promulgated. So a feral cat under that definition really does not have anything to do with humans. So the populations are fluctuating independently of input from the owned cat populations. So they're not breeding with owned cats, nobody's leaving a bowl of milk out for them or anything like that. And so what that means is that actually in many of the areas where we're living in and doing our conservation activity, many of us, if we're experiencing unowned cat problems, we're probably actually dealing with stray cats more than feral cats. That may be not true in really deep remote areas, but in many cases that will be within. But that ownership status, I guess, in some ways is irrelevant to the issue of how much of an impact they're having, because we know that all cats can have some significant impact on biodiversity. And so when we're thinking about our conservation outcomes, really, Auckland Council tends to group them in that sort of overarching unowned versus owned distinction. And so we know really that there are different strategies that are needed for managing cat impacts depending on the ownership class of the animals. So we may be doing control of the unowned animals, but it's also really important for us to focus on the responsible pet ownership as well, for both directly for the managing the impacts of owned cats in terms of their own predation, but also in terms of preventing them from subsidising that unowned population through breeding. So in terms of what we do, we get a lot of questions from the community asking, is Auckland Council going to do some cat control to protect the places that you're really treasuring and working to protect in other ways? So, and sorry, I realise some of the text on this has gone horrible, so it doesn't all fit on one line, but hopefully you can still read it. So under our regional pest management plan, it's our sort of guiding document for pest management in the region. So our politicians thought long and hard about the issue of cat management. They received a lot of submissions on this topic, and so as a result of that, they had some quite clear criteria that we've said we will only do cat control in certain circumstances. So the first thing is that there need to be threatened species populations present that we are protecting from cat predation. Otherwise we won't be doing cat control. We also need to be doing it as part of integrated management of other pest pressures. So we're never just picking on cats, we're also managing other things like, for instance, rats or stoats or whatever else it is that is a pressure for those pest species. And that's good practice in the sense that, ecologically, that it's not, we can have perverse outcomes if we take, for example, one predator out of a system and don't manage otherwise. So this is something we should be doing anyway. We also were told to only do cat control in areas that are zoned rural in the Auckland Unitary Plan. So we don't do cat control in urban zoned areas, but we will do them in rural zoned areas. And the other thing is that we need to give the neighbours plenty of notice if we're going to be doing cat control. So we will, if we're doing cat control, we will always notify all of the neighbours, and that's in a built-up area. That'll be everybody out to about 1.2 kilometres from the site that we're doing cat control, and in a less built-up, more rural kind of landscape, we'll be notifying people up to 2.4 kilometres away. And so the vast majority of where we will be doing cat control, we will always be using live capture traps, which means that we are then able to check those traps, make sure that we're not, if we're catching somebody's pet cat, that we're identifying that animal and we can take it back to the owner, perhaps with some education about the responsible pet ownership things that they could do to reduce the chances of their cat straying into that area in the future. There are a very small number of places where Auckland Council will use kill traps for cats, and they tend to be places that are quite remote, and they are typically really intensively managed threatened species locations. So, for example, in your area, like Arkana Park and sometimes at Whātako. For people who are interested in doing cat control yourselves as a community, we do have some advice on our website. So I don't know if you're already familiar with our website, Te Ake Tāmaki Makaurau. If you haven't already checked it out, I really encourage you to have a look, not just for this, but more broadly. So the information I'm going to be talking about today is just one of a whole range of, there are how-to guides for different things about how to practical tips for how to do various conservation things. There's also information about our Indigenous ecosystems and species in the region, and lots of other really useful information. So check out Te Ake Tāmaki Makaurau on our website. But specifically today, I draw your attention to the guide to controlling pest animals. So when you're coming into the how-to guides section of Te Ake, you'll see this, and you click on that yellow bit that I've highlighted. And then you'll see down the left-hand side, there's steps 1, 2, and 3. So on step 2, I'm just fast-forwarding you through the process. So you'll see the pest animal control guidelines. And so in that, we've got some information about how to do cat control, if that's something that you're interested in. Oops, I keep clicking the wrong thing. So if you are going to do cat control, I really encourage you to look into this, because there are some quite significant things that you need to be aware of before you embark on doing cat control. I'm just going to give you the very potted version here today. I really do recommend that you get into it and read the more fulsome version for yourself. So the first thing, number one sort of take-home message from today, is that it's really important that you always do everything that you can to avoid causing harm to owned cats. And so that means that in most places, the only option that we would be recommending to you is to use those live capture traps. So it means you're then able to check the cat afterwards, find out whether it was owned or not, and so that you're not accidentally killing your neighbour's pet cat. Another thing is that you should be ideally notifying your neighbours. Now I know this can be a tricky conversation, and you may or may not feel comfortable broaching it with your neighbours, but if you can, I encourage you to do so. But one of the most important things is to be keeping it positive. So I'll go into this a little bit more further on. I've got some slides about responsible pet ownership, and all of the stuff in there really applies to this as well. But really remembering that you want your neighbours' buy-in, and you're not going to get that by having a sort of a confrontational message that tells them that their cat is the devil's spawn and that you've got it in for it. It's just not going to help. And then the third sort of key thing in this section really is to make sure that you've got a plan in place for how you will check whether a cat is owned, and that does mean scanning for microchips as well as just looking for the belled collar and that sort of thing. And how you're going to do that. You may have a microchip scanner that you're able to operate yourself, or if you don't, then you might need to get a relationship with a vet who you can take them to, who can do that scanning for you. Other sort of practical tips for your cat control if you're doing it. So winter is the best time to be trapping for cats. It's partly because the food is scarcest at that time, so they're most likely to be drawn into your trap. But we'll also encourage you to avoid trapping in the springtime, because that's when there may be kittens. And again, potentially if you trap the mother and leave the kittens, then you're going to starve to death, and that's not a humane death for them. There are also a number of quite important legal things that you need to be aware of if you're doing cat control. So one of them is that if you are setting those live capture traps, to make sure that the cats are not left in there for a long period of time, being exposed to the elements without food and water, there is a legal time requirement on when you have to check those traps. So you must check them within 12 hours of sunrise on that day that they've been set. So it is quite labour intensive doing cat control. And ideally you're going to be setting those traps in places where they're reasonably sheltered and the cats aren't going to be really exposed to the elements. There are also restrictions on some types of traps, so specifically leg hold traps. You must not set them within 150 metres of a dwelling house unless the person at that house has explicitly given you permission to set that trap. Other types of traps, there's not that legal requirement, but as I say, it's good practice to let the neighbours know. And as I just talked about, just as you need to have a plan for how you will check for microchips or ownership, you also need to have a plan for what you're going to do with an animal after you've caught it in that live capture trap, because obviously the killing hasn't been done for you as it would in a kill trap, and so you need to either be able to take that animal to somewhere that it can be rehomed if it's socialised, or have it euthanized, either by a vet or in some cases, if you are competent with a firearm, you may be able to do it yourself, but it's really important that that's an instantaneous death that's really humane. So as I say, really encourage you to check out our guidelines on the website for more detail. And so that's enough of the killing part of it. I'm just going to dip into the responsible pet ownership because, as I said before, although my brief is about feral cats here today, actually that responsible pet ownership stuff is the fence at the top of the cliff. Partly because it avoids some of that social conflict that we see around cat control, but also because ultimately, we need to be reducing both the impact of owned cats, but also, they're subsidising into that unowned cat population. So, and the thing I like about responsible pet ownership is that it's a real win-win situation in the sense that all actually of these behaviours, they're things that are protecting native wildlife, but they're all actually good for the cats as well. And that's great because we know that most cat owners are not actually motivated by messages around benefits to wildlife. There's lots and lots of research which shows that cat owners will not change their behaviour because you tell them that their cat is damaging to the environment, or that they should, because they should care about the wildlife. So the fact that these behaviours are good for the cats as well is really excellent. And so on that, we know that we need to draw on these real sort of behaviour change principles in order to be effective when we're having conversations about cats. And this is whether this is your chat with your neighbour in person, or whether it's the letter that you're writing to advise people that there's cat control going on in your neighbourhood. These principles apply equally. So you need to be really cognizant that your audience is different from you. You will never turn your audience into you. They have different values from you, and your job is not to change those values, and you won't change those values, but your goal is to change their behaviour. So being really clear about that distinction, and one of the things that you can do that helps to build that is to find common ground. So it may not be about cats, it may not be about conservation, it may be about a book that you've read, or your kid's soccer game, or whatever it is, but the things where you can find a connection with those people that helps to build that relationship. It's as part of that sort of value stuff, it's really important to remember that nearly half of Auckland households have a cat, and most of those people say that they have a cat because of companionship, and that they consider that cat to be a part of their family. So I'm really hammering home that message that, if you're not taking these things into account when you're framing up your messages to people, you simply won't be successful. And so part of that too is around having really positive messaging. So it's really tempting to have the picture of the cat doing real damage to the environment or that sort of thing, but actually what we want is to be framing up people to think about the thing that we want to see happen rather than the thing that we're trying to avoid. So if you're using images in your communication about cats, it's really great to use images that are where you see a positive relationship with a cat, human interaction with the cat, playing with the cat, those kind of things that evoke a cat being happy, a cat being at home, a cat being stimulated by that human, and therefore avoiding the boredom, avoiding that need to go out and hunt. Because we do know that playing with toys, that kind of enrichment stuff, is really positive for reducing hunting instinct. Excuse me. And not using these photos, images, language, words that are reinforcing the norms that we don't want to see. So every time you use a photo like this, you're reinforcing the idea that it's normative for cats to go out and hunt. Doesn't have to be, it's just that that's what we're all programmed to think. Similarly, if you say, I'm not anti-cat, but, what people are hearing is, oh, you're anti-cat. So really try to avoid saying the thing or showing the thing that you don't want people to see, and lean more on those more positive pictures. And so this is, again, a really potted digest of how-to on responsible pet ownership, but we do have more information on our website. So we've got two things. One on the left is a presentation that we put together at Auckland Council that really steps you through what are the responsible pet ownership behaviours that can reduce cats' impact on the environment, and how can we communicate effectively about them. And the other one is from Predator Free New Zealand, and similarly it's drawing on some of that behaviour change science to really give you some pro tips about how to do a better job of talking about cat control. And one last thing is also we have a relationship with SPCA, and so you may have seen we've had Auckland Council sponsored desexing drives, so we specifically target our money towards high conservation value areas, including Waitakere, where we're offering free desexing for cats living in those areas. Not on at the moment, but they come in sort of batches of, pulses of time when that's available. So keep your eye out for these, and if you see it, we really appreciate your help promoting them to the community. So that's all from me, thank you. But if we've got time, I can take questions. I'm just going to grab my glass of water.